Hello and welcome to my video, where I'm going to be showing you how to do the duplicate stitch method of Colourwork. This can also be called Swiss darning. Duplicate stitch is ideal for adding small areas of colourwork to your knitting, such as adding eyes to knitted animals or a monogram to a blanket. You actually add duplicate stitch colourwork after you finish knitting, so it's more of an afterthought method. For instance, here you can see me adding a duplicate stitch snowflake to a knitted bauble. Just bear in mind that duplicate stitch adds another layer on top of your stitches, so the result is a little bit more bulky when compared to something like intarsia. And as for why it's called duplicate stitch, it's because you're literally duplicating the stitch below, albeit in a different colour. Note that you'll always be adding duplicate stitch on top of stockinette stitch, and I also recommend blocking your knitting before you begin so the stitches are as even as possible. Here you can see I've got some knitting graph paper, and I've drawn a square that represents the stockinette portion of this swatch, minus the edge stitches. It's 12 blocks wide and 12 blocks high, where each block represents a stitch. The difference between knitting graph paper and normal graph paper is that knitting graph paper has rectangles rather than squares, and this more closely represents stitches. Right, so now I've drawn out the area I've got available, I'm now going to draw a random line. And then I'm going to shade in all of the blocks that are closest to this line, and that will give me a pattern. You want to try and avoid jumping too far between stitches you're duplicating, because this will create long yarn floats on the back of your work. These can get caught on things, so just try and plan the best path for you to take before you start. I'm now going to transfer this pattern to my knitting using duplicate stitch. Before you start, if it helps you, you can mark the stitches you need to duplicate using stitch markers. Note that for right-handed people it's easier to move from right to left where possible, because the needle needs to point in the direction you're going in. Otherwise it's easy to twist the stitches accidentally. And vice versa, of course, for left-handed people who will find it easier to move from left to right. Because I'm right-handed, I want to travel from right to left as much as possible. To begin, make sure you choose a yarn that's in a colour that contrasts well with the knitting you're adding it to. Also, make sure the yarn is the same weight as the yarn in your knitting, or perhaps slightly thicker. This is because the yarn needs to fully cover the stitches below. Once you've chosen your yarn, cut a length that's no longer than your arm span. The longer it is, the easier it'll be to tangle. Then feed this yarn into a yarn needle. If you look at your stockinette stitch, you'll see that it's made up of V-shapes. Each V is made up of 2 strands of yarn, and that's the visible part of a stitch. Choose the stitch you first want to duplicate, and then come up through the base of that V-shape. Make sure you leave a long enough yarn tail to weave in later. Then you need to go under the 2 strands of the V-shape above the V-shape you're currently duplicating. You want to do this horizontally, and the needle needs to move in the direction you're generally moving in. So in this case, we're moving from left to right. Make sure when you're picking up these 2 strands horizontally that you're only picking up these 2 strands. You're not picking up any additional strands underneath. Then you need to go back down through the knitting at the base of the V-shape you're duplicating. So you're going down through the same place you previously came up through. And that's 1 duplicate stitch completed. And you simply repeat this for every stitch you want to duplicate. So we move to the right and we come up through the base of the next stitch we want to duplicate. Then go under the 2 strands of the V-shape above, making sure we only pick up 2 strands. And then back down through the base. And that's the second duplicate stitch completed. You never want to pull hard on this yarn because that will make the duplicate stitch disappear into the stitch below. Now I'm going to move down to the stitch below, and it's exactly the same concept. You come up through the base of the V shape you want to cover, then you go under the V shape above horizontally, and in this case it includes the original stitch plus the duplicate stitch. And then you go back down through the base. And then I repeat the same for the next few stitches. So come up through the base, go horizontally underneath the duplicate stitch and the stitch below, and then back down through the base. If you need to, as you go along, you can use your yarn needle to adjust the tension of your duplicate stitches. You want to make sure that they fully cover the stitches below. If you want to speed up the process, then when you go back down through the base, you can come up through the base of the next stitch you're going to duplicate at the same time. That just cuts out one extra step. And for the rest of the pattern, it's just the same concept repeated. Another use for duplicate stitch is to correct mistakes. For instance, if you're doing Fair Isle and you do a blue stitch instead of a white stitch, then instead of unravelling, you can just change the colour at the end using duplicate stitch. This method doesn't work with garter stitch because when you look at garter stitch, you're seeing many parts of the stitch, not just the legs of the loop. You therefore can't cover all of the yarn that's visible on the front. And one last thing I wanted to show you was if you have a stitch that's quite a distance from the other stitches, then you just need to make sure that you don't make a long yarn float at the back. So I would go under a few strands at the back, like so, and then do the duplicate stitch. If you didn't do this, you would just have one long strand of yarn between your stitches. As you go along, you might also want to stretch your knitting a little bit, just to make sure the tension is not too tight. And the last step is to weave in the yarn tails. If the yarn tails are close enough, some people like to knot them together, but if you do this, make sure you leave enough slack so the knitting maintains its stretchiness. Another method is to actually use the duplicate stitch, but this time on the back of your knitting. All you need to do is follow the path of the yarn. Feel free to go over to my weaving in video to see this more closely. You have to be careful when you're doing this method to only pick up the yarn strands on the back of your knitting. If you accidentally pick up the yarn strands on the front, your yarn tail will be visible, as you can see here. And even if you do this method completely correctly, it's possible you could still slightly see the yarn tail from the front. So I personally would only recommend this method if you can fit it behind the duplicate stitch colourwork. What I generally do is just weave it into the back of the colourwork. There's not really any particular method, I just make sure it's secure. Just note that if you're weaving in behind your duplicate stitch, then that's 3 layers of yarn, so it can end up quite bulky. And that's it, that's how you do duplicate stitch colourwork. I really hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.